cameras and then later kind of rehoused and repurposed for use on cinema cameras. Now, if you're looking for full frame coverage from a zoom or from anamorphics, that's where things actually get a little tricky, right? You've got Zeiss compact zooms. I've actually used the Zeiss compact zoom 28 to 80 quite a bit with this camera, and it works really well. Ingenu's actually created a couple of fairly budget-friendly zooms with their Easy 1 and Easy 2. And the cool thing about them is they can be a Super 35 zoom, or they can be converted to cover full-frame sensors as well. Then on the higher end, you've got Fujinon with their Premista series. So if you're looking for full-frame anamorphic lenses, your options are even more limited. I mean, there are a few companies like Cooke and a couple others that are bringing full-frame anamorphic to market, but your options are still pretty limited. But what I'm finding is the interesting thing about the way the anamorphic lens covers the sensor, especially since in anamorphic you're going to be in a 2.4 aspect ratio, the Super 35 anamorphics that I've tested on the LF have actually covered the sensor pretty well. So having said all of that, really what I think the question should be is, I mean, honestly, what lenses can't you use on the camera? Now, I've actually talked to a surprising number of people who think that their Super 35 lenses are useless on a full frame camera, and that all the lenses that they've grown to love, or even maybe that they own, won't work with the new full frame cameras. But honestly, there's a few options. Now, obviously, if you're going to put Super 35 lenses on a large format camera, there's going to be some limitations and some compromises. The question then is, are those compromises and limitations acceptable for your particular project? And they might be. So one way you can use Super 35 lenses on a full frame sensor is with an expander. Now, if you don't know what that is, an expander is basically another optical element that goes between your lens and the sensor. And what it does is it takes the image circle of your lens and expands it so that it fills a bigger circle and projects a bigger image onto the sensor.
Yes, science!
Now, of course, when you're using an expander, there are some compromises, both in focal length and light loss. So for example, if you're using the 1.6 times expander from Tokina, there is a one-stop light loss, as well as all of your focal lengths are now going to be 1.6 times longer. Now again, those are compromises that may or may not be crucial to your particular project. I always personally got hung up on losing a stop of light. I mean, I want the shallow depth of field as I can get, right? And if I'm losing a stop of light, how am I going to get that? But then, of course, what I realized is a full-frame sensor is more sensitive to light and has a shallower depth of field. So a one-stop loss in light really isn't that big of a deal. Now, I don't claim to know how all the math works. I've read through discussions on how depth of field is calculated, and it depends, of course, on the two exact sensors that you're comparing, and it's a long, intense calculation. But basically what it boils down to, once you follow the equation all the way to the end, is the difference between a full-frame sensor and Super 35 sensor is about a stop and a third, more or less.
It's science.
So what that means is, for example, if you're at a T4 on a full-frame sensor, you're going to get the equivalent depth of field of a 2.8 on a Super 35 sensor. Now, of course, that's not exactly exact, but for me, it's close enough to give me a reference so I can compare the two. A few weeks ago, I needed to shoot an interview. This is for a personal project, so all the budget was coming out of my own pocket. And, you know, thanks to COVID-19, that meant I had zero budget whatsoever. In fact, if I didn't already own the camera, I probably wouldn't have done the shoot at all. So I went to the rental house to kind of see what my options were. I'm looking for something cheap,